Good morning. Have you missed me? I know. I actually got sick and I was down and out for 2 days. That doesn't happen very often. I haven't been sick in years, but I was. So that's why you haven't seen me. So I saw a special on one of my favorite bands when I was a kid, Van Halen, or as we used to say, Van Freakin' Halen. And they did a bio on David Lee Roth, which I never really knew David's background, and I never really knew the background of the band. Now, for those of you that are too young to know, Van Halen released their first album in, I think, 1978, and it was called Van Halen. And a heavier rock album had never made it on the pop charts before. And when that album was released, they didn't drop albums back then. When that album was released, it landed like an atomic bomb. I mean, it was everywhere. And that band went from obscurity to just the biggest band in the country in like literally overnight. And David Lee Roth was a huge part of that. I saw the band perform 5 times, 3 times with David Lee Roth and 2 times with Sammy Hagar. I've seen a lot of shows in my lifetime. I've seen a lot of performers, including classic performers like the Rat Pack and Sammy Davis Jr. and those guys. I have never seen anybody that comes close to handling a crowd and controlling a crowd and exciting a crowd like David Lee Roth did with Van Halen. There's just never been anybody like him. And they called him at the end of the bio the greatest frontman in the history of rock and roll. And that's right. He is the greatest frontman in the history of rock and roll. And yeah, I'm going to include Mick Jagger and all those guys because while Eddie's talent was you know, unexplainable, David Lee Roth made that band. But now his story is really interesting. So David comes from Pasadena, California, as does Eddie Van Halen and his brother, Alex. They both were in the same area at the same time. They were in high school and they both were in bands, but they were in different bands. Now, they had one thing in common. The Van Halen brothers were immigrants from the Netherlands, and David Lee Roth was the only Jewish kid in a community that didn't have a large Jewish population in Pasadena. So they felt like a little bit of outcasts. David, from when he was a little kid, said that he was going to be the front man of a great rock and roll band and the greatest front man ever. That was his goal. That was his outcome. I never knew that about the guy. He was very supported by his father. And Pasadena at the time had all kinds of backyard parties. That was the thing in Pasadena. So the Van Halen brothers played in their band, and David played in his band. Now, the Van Halen brothers were clearly great musicians from early on, but they did not have a great lead vocalist. And the band that David was in, he obviously was great, but he wasn't part of a great band. So you would think that them coming together would be easy. Well, he actually auditioned for the Van Halen brothers more than once, and they said no because of his vocals, because he actually couldn't sing all that well. But he could perform like nobody had ever seen. And he was willing to do that even when he was in high school. He was willing to put on the crazy clothes and jump around and do the acrobatics and do all of the stuff. He became that persona right from the beginning. But it wasn't easy for this band, all of which I never knew, because if you saw the band first album, boom, there's this massive success. So it seemed like that's how everything went for them. Not true. So first he was rejected by the Van Halen brothers more than once before they finally decided to come together. And I think the parents actually had something to do with that. Then they went and they practiced 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, every day for 4 hours. Then Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, they would go play at these backyard parties, and they would play till like 4 in the morning. Another thing that got the Van Halen brothers to go with David is because he had equipment. His dad bought him all of this equipment, and so the brothers didn't have access to that. So they were like, all right, well, we'll go with this guy because he's got equipment too, and we'll figure out how to teach him to sing. So they performed and performed and performed and performed that 10,000 hours of practice that we talk about, like the Beatles did when they went to Germany and just played and played and played and played. Well, then the one that had the vision for the band was David. They all wanted to be in a band and do stuff, but David was the one that said, we're going to be the greatest rock and roll band of all time. We're going to be, he didn't say greatest, he said biggest rock and roll band of all time. So he got them on the Sunset Strip, but even then, it took forever for them to get their break. They played for 5 years on the Sunset Strip. Every night that they could, they played and played and played and played. Then one time, Gene Simmons from Kiss comes backstage and says, I want to sign you guys. And you think, okay, well, this is going to be their big break. They go to New York and they talk to Warner Brother Records in New York, or talk to one of the record companies in New York, and they rejected him. And why did they reject him? David Lee Roth, because of his vocals. They said his vocals were not good enough. They would never make it as a band. So they still didn't get their big break. It was another year before they finally signed with a local record company and figured out that they were going to create their own album. And then, of course, the first album dropped, and the rest is history. So, this shows us again our pattern. He set out with his outcome in mind. He knew exactly what he wanted. I want to be the best lead of a rock and roll band, the best front man of a rock and roll band of all time. And I want to be in the biggest. He didn't say best. He would say biggest rock and roll band of all time, which arguably Van Halen, maybe did that. They certainly were the biggest of their time. That's for sure. Maybe U2 ended up bigger. You can argue the Rolling Stones, all that stuff. But during their heyday, there was nobody bigger than Van Halen and nobody bigger than David Lee Roth. And he wasn't afraid to put in the time. He worked and he worked and he worked and he worked and he worked, and he always had that vision. Eddie and his brother did not have the vision to be in a band that was that big. It was David's vision that carried the day. Once they got there, then they had the vision of how to change the music and keep evolving. Dave actually resisted that. He wanted the music to stay the same. It was Eddie that said, let's do keyboards and let's do all of these other things. And then obviously egos got in the way and success got in the way and the band broke up. But it's our same message, which is know your outcome and be very specific about what you want, and then take massive action and never give up. Never give up on the side of that vision that you want. Keep going and going and going. And I'd never heard Dave's story, and it was really cool to hear it as to how much he wanted that from a very young age and how hard he was willing to work in order to get there. And I can tell you from seeing that band several times, he got there. The guy was unbelievable when he was on stage. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry I missed a couple of days. As you can tell, still got a little bit of a cough. I want to say hi, Mr. Lampy. Great to see you. Liz, great to see you this morning. Thank you so much for watching. Mr. Egan, thank you for tuning in. And Patty, thank you all for saying hey. It means the world to me. Have a great day, everybody. Let's take care of each other. We're all in this together.